Of all Star Trek's major character deaths, this is the one that really made me go WTF. Star Trek has never been shy about death. For a franchise built on optimism, exploration, and the belief that humanity can grow beyond its worst instincts, Star Trek has also developed a long and sometimes uncomfortable tradition of killing off characters in ways that are meant to shock, devastate, or redefine the stakes. Some of these deaths feel inevitable. Others feel noble. A few feel tragically beautiful. And then there are the deaths that leave you staring at the screen, remote in hand, muttering a very specific phrase. Wait. What? For me, no major Star Trek character death has ever earned a more sincere, baffled, and borderline offended WTF than Lieutenant Commander Jadzia Dax in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Not because death itself was off limits. Not because DS9 wasn't already darker or more morally complex than its predecessors. But because the way Jadzia died, abruptly, casually, and seemingly without regard for everything the character represented, felt less like a storytelling necessity and more like a betrayal of the show's own intelligence. Star Trek deaths usually mean something. To understand why Jadzia's death hits so strangely, it helps to look at how Star Trek usually handles the loss of major characters. Spock's death in The Wrath of Khan is practically sacred text to fans. It's earned, thematic, and inseparable from the movie's meditation on sacrifice, friendship, and mortality, even if you knew he'd eventually return. The moment itself lands with devastating weight. Tasha Yar's death on The Next Generation is sudden and ugly, but intentionally so. Denise Crosby wanted out, and the randomness of her death reinforces the episode's horror movie premise. The show later revisits Tasha's legacy, arguably giving her more emotional depth in death than she ever received in life. Data's sacrifice in Star Trek Nemesis is controversial, but it's undeniably framed as meaningful. His arc, learning humanity, choosing selflessness, embracing mortality, culminates in a choice that aligns perfectly with who he's become. Even newer Star Trek deaths, like Hemmer on Strange New Worlds, are given room to breathe. Hemmer's loss hurts because the show takes time to mourn him, to let the crew and the audience process what he meant. Jadzia Dax's death, by contrast, feels like it happens at the story rather than within it. Jadzia Dax wasn't just another officer. By the time Deep Space Nine reached Season 6, Jadzia Dax wasn't just a fan favorite, she was foundational. She was the living embodiment of the Trill concept. Centuries of memory, experience, and identity housed in one person. Through her, DS9 explored questions of gender, sexuality, continuity of self, and cultural tradition long before mainstream TV was comfortable doing so. She was a brilliant science officer, a warrior who could hold her own with Klingons, and a deeply empathetic friend who served as the emotional bridge between characters like Sisko, Kira, Bashir, and Worf. Her relationship with Worf, in particular, had finally settled into something complex and mature after seasons of build-up. Jadzia felt integrated into the station in a way few characters ever do. She wasn't expendable. She wasn't narratively cornered. Her story still had room to grow, which makes what happens in Tears of the Prophets feel less like tragedy and more like narrative whiplash. The death scene that comes out of nowhere. Jadzia Dax dies because Gul Dukat, possessed by the Pa-Wraiths, walks into the Byron Temple on Deep Space Nine and shoots her. That's it. No heroic stand. No final conversation. No dramatic build-up signaling that this is the end of a beloved character. 1 second she's standing there, having just reassured Sisko, and the next she's on the floor, mortally wounded, dying in Worf's arms. It's shocking, yes, but not in a way that feels purposeful. The episode is primarily focused on cosmic mythology. The Prophets abandoning Bajor, the Dominion War turning against the Federation, and Dukat's descent into full-blown religious fanaticism. Jadzia's death is almost incidental, a footnote in a much larger plot about gods and destiny. And that's the problem. The show barely has time to care, so how are we supposed to? One of the most WTF aspects of Jadzia's death is how quickly the show moves on. Yes, Worf is devastated. His grief is real, raw, and convincingly portrayed. But structurally, the episode doesn't pause long enough to fully honor Jadzia as a character. The emotional climax belongs to Sisko's crisis of faith, not to the loss of one of the station's core crew members. In any other Star Trek series, the death of a main cast character would dominate the narrative space. Here, it feels almost inconvenient. And then, to make matters worse, Season 7 introduces Ezri Dax almost immediately. While Ezri eventually becomes an interesting character in her own right, her arrival unintentionally reinforces the sense that Jagia was removed to make room for something else, not because her story had reached its natural conclusion. The real-world context makes it worse. It's impossible to separate Jagia Dax's death from what was happening behind the scenes. Terry Farrell's departure from Deep Space Nine has been widely discussed over the years, with reports of contract disputes and an increasingly uncomfortable work environment. Regardless of which version of events you believe, the end result is the same. A character who deserved a thoughtful, meaningful exit was written out abruptly. Knowing this doesn't soften the blow, it sharpens it, because once you're aware of the external factors, Jagia's death stops feeling like a bold creative choice and starts feeling like collateral damage from production politics. That realization retroactively drains emotional resonance from the moment and replaces it with frustration. When Star Trek fails, it often fails in interesting ways. This wasn't interesting. It was messy. Why Jagia's death feels worse than others. Plenty of Star Trek characters have died unfairly. That's not what makes Jagia's death stand out. What makes it uniquely baffling is that it contradicts Deep Space Nine's usual strengths. This is the show that excels at long-term storytelling. The show that lets consequences ripple across seasons. The show that understands character arcs better than almost any other entry in the franchise. And yet, when it comes to Jagia Dax, a character who embodied continuity, legacy, and memory, the show chooses one of its least thoughtful exits. There's an irony there that's hard to ignore. A character whose entire species revolves around preserving experience across lifetimes is killed in a way that feels oddly disposable. The legacy she left behind despite everything. And yet, because this is Star Trek, Jagia Dax's impact survives even the circumstances of her death. Ezri Dax inherits not just the symbiont, but the unresolved emotional fallout. Worf's grief continues to shape him. Sisko's failure to protect one of his closest friends feeds into his growing disillusionment with the Prophets. Jagia's absence is felt in every corner of the station. In retrospect, that lingering presence is what saves her death from being a complete narrative misfire. Still, that doesn't change the initial reaction. The one death that still makes me say, WTF. When I think about Star Trek deaths that hurt, I think of Spock. When I think about deaths that feel cruel, I think of Tasha Yar. When I think about deaths that spark debate, I think of Data. But when I think about the one death that genuinely made me stop and say, out loud, WTF just happened, it's Jagia Dax. Not because it was sad, not because it was shocking, but because it felt wrong in a way Star Trek usually knows how to avoid. Jagia deserved better, not immunity, not immortality, but intention. And in a franchise built on the idea that every life has meaning, her death stands out as the rare moment when Star Trek seemed to forget that rule.